John, the issue that I feel like a continuous person seems obvious from my childhood to
Hmm.
today. I just feel like I'm the same. But you think about it, nothing about me is the same. I don't look the
Hmm.
same. Not a single molecule in my body is the same. A lot of memories I had then, I don't remember now. Uh, how do we deal with this question of personal identity? How can we begin to think about this concept of self?
Well, it's interesting that a concept of personal identity is usually presented as just an example of identity in general. And there's the famous ship of Theseus, where you change all the parts, but you still want to say it's the same ship. But then somebody takes the old parts and puts them back together. So which is the original ship? Now, at some level, we feel, but there isn't any fact of the matter there. You can say which you like. There isn't any fact about which is the real ship. If you want to count the continuity of function as the criterion, or do you want to count the continuity of the parts as the criterion?
Yeah.
The problem with the personal identity is we feel there is a fact that I'm me.
Yeah.
There's some fact about me that makes me me. But that's hard to pin down philosophically because, as you point out, all of my experiences change. All the parts of my body, all the molecules in my body have changed. So what are the grounds? This is why there's a problem about personal identity. What are the grounds that make the issue of personal identity different from the identity of objects generally?
Okay, so let's now talk about the self. I mean, what are some of the key philosophical questions that we want to ask to begin to at least array the landscape so we can address the question?
Well, the most famous negative attack on the notion of the self was by David Hume.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, he said philosophers always talk as if they had this experience of the self. But he says, whenever I try and grab my forehead and think, where is the self? In German, was ist das Ich? Hume says, all I get is a kind of headache. I feel my hand pushing against my head. I feel a vague hangover from last night, but there isn't any self in addition to all of that. And Hume gave a famous destructive examination of the notion of the self, that there isn't any self in addition to all of our particular experiences.
So everything we think is the self is really just some specific experiences, maybe several at the same time. And you can't say, okay, after I have that, what else do I got? You got nothing.
But you see, Hume would go a further step and say, suppose you did have a continuous experience. There's a continuous yellow spot in your visual field that lasted all of your life. That wouldn't be the self. Just be another yellow spot. Just be a yellow spot. It wouldn't do the job of the self. I just think Hume was right, and there is something right about that. But there is another argument that I use, and I want to say this does produce a formal notion of the self, and that is if you ask yourself, how is it possible that you can explain your behavior without giving causally sufficient conditions? I can tell you who I voted for in the last election, my reasons for voting, but they don't determine my vote. I could have had those reasons and still have voted for the other guy. It was up to me. But how is that intelligible? That is, what's the meaning of the claim that I can explain my behavior without giving you causally sufficient conditions? And there I think you can only make sense of that if you suppose that there is a self that makes a reason effective by deciding to act on it. Now, that's not a substantive self because there's no experience of the self. But I'm saying in order to make sense of rational conscious behavior, you have to postulate a point from which that behavior comes. And it's like postulating a point of view when you have visual experiences. I can't make sense out of visual experiences except on the assumption that they come from a point of view. Now, I don't see the point of view, but I know there must be a point of view. Now, analogously with a self, I think we can't make sense out of our experiences, out of our rational conscious decision-making, without postulating this point, the self from which these come. But of course, that it's not itself experience. That is a limit, so to speak, on experience. As the point of view of the I is the limit on visual perception, so the self, as a formal postulate, is the limit on rational conscious action.
That's why you call it formal.
It's purely formal. It means there's no content to it. It doesn't have anything inside it that constitutes its being that self as opposed to another self.
So let's see what follows from that. How then can we define this personal continuity? What are some of the characteristics of personal continuity?
Right. Okay. Well, now I would want to say, let's look at how people actually decide questions of personal identity. How do you prove that you're the same guy who bought this house 20 years ago, or that you're not the guy who was accused of the murder, or whatever? And there, it seems to me, there are several different criteria we employ, in fact. The one that's most basic for us is bodily continuity. If it's the same body, it's the same guy. However, that's not by itself sufficient, because we can imagine cases of brain transplants where if your brain gets put in another guy's body and his brain gets put in your body, well, we're not so confident that body identity does it. Indeed, we might even say, well, you don't even need to change brains. Just imagine that all the wiring in his brain is transferred to yours, and all the wiring, I'm speaking in pretty crude metaphors here, but all the neurobiological features are transformed. Then what are we going to say? Well, here come in some other criteria. Now, a criterion that's very important for us is memory. Locke called it consciousness, but by that he meant I remember things occurring to me in the past, and it is this continuity of memory that gives me the sense that I am a single person that continues throughout this. So that's a first-person criterion that's very important to us. We feel all the same, I'd know who I was if my brain got transplanted into another guy's body. But there's some other criteria. I'm just looking now at criteria we actually employ in real life. Continuity of body, and then, so to speak, orderly changes in bodily development. If I suddenly change like Gregor Samsa into a big insect, or if I suddenly I changed into a mountain, well, then we're not so confident. It's still the same guy. So you have the same body, relative continuity and order and changes in the body, and then continuity of memories. And then a fourth criterion we use is, this is the weakest criterion, but we do employ it, and that is a continuity of personality. There's a famous case of a guy where a steel bar went through his head and he lived, but his personality was totally different. He was, as they say, a completely different guy. He wasn't himself. Now, it's true, he still owned the same property, and he would still pay the same taxes, but everybody who knew him, his name was Phineas Gage, and this was in the 19th century. It's a famous clinical case. But in the case of Phineas Gage, we feel, well, it's really not the same person anymore. He's now a different person. However, those are the rough criteria we actually, I think, employ in everyday life. Why do we feel there must be something more than that? Well, I think perhaps it ties in with what I was saying about the formal notion of the self. We do have this formal notion gives us things like responsibility. It isn't just that I make decisions today and a guy like me made decisions yesterday, but it was the same guy. And indeed, evidence for that is we hold me responsible for yesterday's decisions. And that's only possible. That only makes sense on the assumption of the continuity of the self. So, but I think this is not satisfactory, but I think it's where we are. That is, I think we get rough and ready criteria. You have to postulate a self to make sense of rational behavior. And then our urge is always to think, well, we want something we can't have. We want to find the soul that is at the bottom of all this beer muggy stuff I've been talking about. And of course, there isn't anything. Now, I'll tell you how I think we're going to get out of this, and that is we know more about how the brain works, we will get a better understanding of how it's possible that the brain doesn't just create all these experiences, but it makes them cohere into a continuous sequence of experiences where I experience not just this happening and that happening, but I experience them as all happening to me. So I think the next step in this will be made when we get a better understanding of the neurobiology of the self.
John, let's continue the split brain experiment and take it one step further, because we know we have two halves of the brain. Our memories may be stored in both halves. Let's assume that both halves have the full sense of me, and some experiments, in fact, show that in patients where they had to have their corpus split because of epilepsy, and you really had two personalities. So if you put them in two separate bodies, take some science 1,000 years from now that could do that, now you have two separate bodies, both claiming to be me. Who's me? Well,
I carry it a step further. In fact, in the split brain experiments, the two hemispheres are not identical. You have language in one in the left hemisphere, but let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that they're completely identical, and that we took half of your brain and put it in one body, and the other half and put it in the other body, and each of them had the same memories and the same capacity that you've always had.
Yeah, and maybe destroyed the original body, and so you now have two.
So you're now in these two different bodies, which is really you. And I think the mistake is to suppose there must be some factual answer to that question after what we've just said, and I don't think there is. I think the reason that it's a puzzling case, the reason it bothers us, is that each guy would say with complete confidence, I'm he.
Yeah.
I am the guy.
Right.
But I think that's just a feature of our notion of ourselves, is we're convinced there must be some fact of the matter that's left out of any of these accounts that I could give. And of course, the way we've described it, where you imagine the memories are the same, the body is eliminated, there are two guys that exist, each of them has the same capacities that you had, the same memories, the same professional abilities, all that stuff. Which one is really you? There isn't any answer to that question. However, it does raise a very deep issue, and that is how much of our ordinary concepts rest on certain general facts about the world. So it is a fact about the world that we do not undergo fusion and fission. See, if I was walking down the street and suddenly, like an amoeba, I just split into 2 or 5, well, our notion of personal identity would break down. Or if we had coalescence, if you and I walked down the street and we coalesced into 1, like 2 raindrops, then our personal concept of personal identity would break down.
If that's the way the world worked, which it just as well could have.
It just could have worked that way, and much of our conceptual apparatus is based on the presupposition that the world works in a certain way and not another, and that's how it is with personal identity.
I want to push it one step further. I'm here. I'm going to go into the operation. I have my sense of me, a unity, and then I go into this operation. I'm split apart.
Mm-hmm. Each guy now has the same sense.
Well, that's in a third person. You're describing this in a third person.
Let me be one of the guys. Now, I have the sense, look, I know who I am, and I don't give a damn what these other people say. And that guy over there, whoever he is, he's not me. I am me.
Yeah.
But the problem is, we're imagining that 2 people can each say that. And there isn't any further question. Who's the real one? If the court had to decide, how will you split the money they owned? How will they split their debts? Whose wife is it? I don't think the court would have any grounds other than what we've just said. There isn't any fact of the matter about which is really me, beyond what we've just said.
That being true, what can we then conclude about personal identity?
What we conclude is that the way that our concepts work in general, and this one in particular, is on the basis of certain very general presuppositions about the nature of the world. If we did have fission and fusion, where bodies would coalesce or the same body would split into many, then our concepts would break down. And our present concept rests on the assumptions, a certain set of very general assumptions about how the world works.